Hey, tonight we are going to wander through centuries of fabric and folly, where the clothes people wore were not just garments, but declarations of power, prisons of vanity, and sometimes instruments of death. Picture yourself standing in a grand hall lit by flickering candles, where men and women glide past in silks and satins, their faces powdered white, their postures stiff and unnatural. They are beautiful, yes, but also trapped. Trapped by rules so absurd, so dangerous, that they risked their lives just to look acceptable. This is not fiction. This is history. And tonight, as you settle into your pillow and let your breathing slow, we are going to drift through the strangest, cruelest, and most bewildering fashion rules ever imposed upon human bodies. We will walk through ballrooms where dresses caught fire, through streets where shoes prevented escape from danger, through courts where the wrong color could mean execution. And as we move through these stories, you might begin to recognize something unsettling. These were not ancient primitives. These were people like us, intelligent and thoughtful, who simply lived in a world where appearance mattered more than survival. So dim the lights, close your eyes, and let us begin this journey into the beautiful, terrible world of fashion history. If you enjoy drifting through these tales of human folly and forgotten elegance, consider joining us for more stories that help you sleep while you learn. Let us start with fire, because fire is where so many fashion stories end, in terror and agony and flames that no one could stop. Imagine this. It is November 1851, and you are standing in Windsor Castle, surrounded by the wealthiest, most powerful people in England. The room smells of perfume and candle wax. The women glide across the floor in gowns so wide they seem to float, their skirts billowing out like upside-down flowers, held aloft by steel cages called crinolines. One of these women is Lady Emma Holland, and she is about to die. She does not know it yet. She is laughing, holding a glass of champagne, standing near the fireplace because the November air is cold and the warmth feels pleasant. Her dress, made of layers upon layers of silk and muslin, is held out by a crinoline that extends 6 feet in every direction. It is beautiful, it is fashionable, and it is about to become a funeral pyre. A single spark leaps from the fire. It lands on the hem of her gown. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the fabric ignites with a sound like wind through dry leaves. Within seconds, the flames are climbing her skirt, racing upward with terrifying speed. Lady Holland screams. People rush toward her, but they cannot reach her. The crinoline, that steel cage that made her skirt so beautifully wide, now keeps everyone at a distance. They cannot get close enough to smother the flames. They cannot tear the fabric away. They can only watch as she burns. By the time they manage to cut through the cage and pull her free, her body is charred beyond recognition. She will survive for 3 agonizing days before dying in a morphine haze, her last words reportedly a warning to her daughters never to wear crinolines. But her daughters will ignore that warning. Because fashion, as we will discover tonight, is more powerful than love, more persuasive than reason, and more seductive than survival itself. Lady Holland was not alone. Between 1850 and 1870, over 3,000 women died from their dresses catching fire. 3,000 documented deaths in England alone, not counting France, America, or the rest of Europe. Not counting the unreported cases, the servants and working women whose deaths did not make it into official records. 3,000 women burned alive because fashion demanded they wear cages made of steel and fabric soaked in starch, walking through a world lit by open flames. The British Medical Journal, that bastion of scientific respectability, dedicated entire sections to what they called crinoline casualties. Every week, new reports. A woman in Manchester, dead after her skirt caught fire while she was cooking. A girl in London, 14 years old, dead after brushing against a candle. A mother in Edinburgh, dead after her crinoline knocked over an oil lamp, trapping her children in the flames with her. The stories are endless, they are repetitive, and they were completely preventable. But prevention would have required women to stop wearing crinolines, and that was unthinkable. Because a woman without a crinoline was not fashionable, and a woman who was not fashionable was not marriageable. And a woman who was not marriageable was not financially secure. And a woman who was not financially secure faced poverty, shame, and social death. So they wore the crinolines. They wore them knowing the danger. They wore them after attending funerals for friends who had burned. They wore them because the alternative seemed worse. Let us talk about what a crinoline actually was, because understanding the mechanics of this death trap helps us understand the madness. A crinoline was a cage made of steel hoops connected by fabric tapes, worn under a skirt to make it balloon outward. The hoops increased in size from waist to hem, creating a dome shape that could extend 5, 6, even 7 feet in diameter. The entire structure weighed only a few pounds, which was considered an improvement over the previous fashion of wearing 6 or 7 heavy petticoats to achieve the same shape. Women praised the crinoline for being lighter, more comfortable, easier to move in. They said it liberated them from the weight of multiple skirts. What they did not say, or perhaps did not realize, was that they had traded weight for flammability. Because while the steel cage itself would not burn, everything draped over it would. And once the fabric caught fire, the cage became a prison. You could not remove a crinoline quickly. It tied at the waist with multiple laces. It had to be lifted over your head, assuming you could reach it through the flames. And if you were wearing a corset as well, which most women were, you needed help to undress even under normal circumstances. So when the fire started, there was no escape. You could run, which only fed oxygen to the flames. You could scream, which did nothing. You could pray, which also did nothing. And you could wait for someone to reach you through the cage, through the flames, through the panic, and somehow save you. Most of the time, no one could. There is a particular story that haunts me, preserved in the archives of the British Library. A young woman named Margaret Davy, 14 years old, working as a kitchen maid in a house in London. It is 1858. She is wearing a crinoline because even servants want to be fashionable. Even girls who will never attend a ball or meet a gentleman want to feel beautiful. She is standing at the stove stirring a pot. The crinoline, which extends 3 feet to either side, brushes against the open flame. Her skirt ignites. She tries to run to the door, but the crinoline is too wide. She cannot fit through the doorway. She is trapped in the kitchen with the fire. The cook tries to help, tries to push her through, but the steel hoops catch on the doorframe. By the time they think to drag her to the scullery where the doorway is wider, she has stopped moving. The coroner's report, written in the neat, careful hand of a man who has seen too many of these cases, notes that the deceased was trapped by her garments and could not escape the conflagration. He recommends that women cease wearing such dangerous attire. His recommendation is ignored. Now, you might think that after 3,000 deaths, someone would have banned crinolines. Some government official would have said, "Enough, this fashion is killing people, we are making it illegal." But that did not happen. Because fashion was not seen as something governments could regulate, not really. There were sumptuary laws about who could wear certain fabrics and colors, which we will explore later tonight, but laws about the safety of clothing, that was considered an overstep. Besides, the fashion industry argued, the problem was not the crinolines, it was careless women. If women would simply be more careful around fire, there would be no problem. This argument appeared in editorials and advice columns throughout the 1850s and 1860s. Women were scolded for their carelessness, their vanity, their foolish disregard for safety. One particularly infuriating article from 1861, preserved in the Times of London archives, blamed women for standing too close to fires, for not paying attention, for prioritizing fashion over common sense. The article did not mention that fires were everywhere in Victorian homes, that cooking required open flames, that lighting required candles and oil lamps, that staying warm required fireplaces in every room. It did not mention that men also stood near fires and somehow did not burst into flames with alarming regularity. It blamed women. It always blamed women. But here is the truly maddening part. There were flame-resistant crinolines. In 1860, a chemist named Frederick Grace Calvert patented a treatment that made fabric fire-resistant. He demonstrated it publicly, holding treated cloth over an open flame and showing how it would char but not ignite, smolder but not spread. He offered to treat crinolines for a reasonable fee. Almost no one took him up on it. Because the treatment made the fabric slightly heavier and less flowing, it changed the way the skirt moved, the way it draped, the way it looked. And looking right was more important than being safe. Fashion magazines acknowledged the existence of flame-resistant treatments, but noted that they made gowns less elegant. So women chose elegance. They chose the beautiful drape of untreated silk over the safety of chemically protected fabric. They chose death over unfashionable stiffness. And when they burned, when they died screaming in agony while their families watched helpless, society shook its head and said, "What a tragedy, if only she had been more careful." Let us move backward in time now, before the crinoline, to understand where this madness came from. Because the crinoline did not appear from nowhere. It was the latest iteration of a fashion that had existed for centuries, the fashion of making women as wide as possible. In the 1500s, Spanish noblewomen wore farthingales, cone-shaped cages made of willow hoops that made their skirts flare out from waist to floor. The fashion spread to England, where Queen Elizabeth I embraced it with typical excess. Elizabeth's farthingales were so wide that she could not fit through normal doorways. She had to turn sideways, shuffle through carefully, hope that her servants had opened both doors if there were double doors. Court reports from the 1580s describe Elizabeth's skirts as extending up to 6 feet in diameter. 6 feet! That is wider than most people are tall. She was a walking table. And because the queen wore farthingales, every woman at court had to wear them too. Not wanted to, had to. Appearing at court without a proper farthingale was social suicide. It marked you as poor, provincial, out of touch. So women bankrupted themselves buying these enormous cage structures, these architectural marvels that required carpenters and blacksmiths to construct. The farthingale created its own ecosystem of problems. Women could not see their own feet, so they tripped constantly. They could not reach items on tables because the farthingale kept them too far away. They could not embrace anyone, could not sit in normal chairs, could not ride in normal carriages. Society adapted. Carpenters built wider chairs. Coachmakers built wider carriages. Servants learned to walk ahead of their mistresses, clearing the way, warning of obstacles. And women learned to navigate a world designed for normal human proportions while occupying the space of 3 people. There is a wonderful account from 1617 written by Lady Anne Clifford in her diary. She describes attending a wedding where the bride's farthingale got wedged in the church doorway. Not caught, wedged. The wooden frame was stuck between the doorposts and the bride could not move forward or backward. Lady Anne writes that the poor bride stood trapped for nearly 15 minutes while men worked to free her, and all the while the guests laughed most heartily, though the bride herself wept with vexation and shame. Can you imagine? Your wedding day, stuck in the door, everyone laughing. And the solution was not to remove the farthingale. Oh no. The solution was to remove the door frame. They literally disassembled part of the church rather than disassemble the dress. Priorities. The farthingale eventually evolved into the panniers of the 18th century, which took the concept of width to new extremes. Panniers were not cone-shaped but rectangular, extending straight out from the hips on either side. French noblewomen in the court of Louis XVI wore panniers that could reach 3 feet on each side, making them 6 feet wide in total. There are surviving examples in museums, and when you see them in person, your first thought is surely, no one actually wore these. This must be a joke, an art installation, a satirical exaggeration. But no, these were real. Women really wore them. They wore them to balls, to dinners, to church. They wore them knowing they could not fit through doors, could not sit at tables, could not stand close to another person. The panniers had hinges built into them so they could flip upward when a woman sat down, rising on either side like wings. Can you picture it? A woman sitting and her skirt flapping up around her ears, standing and it settling back down. Mechanical clothing, furniture you wear. Now, let us talk about what happened to the bodies inside these garments, because making women wider was only part of the fashion. Making them smaller was equally important. While skirts grew wider, waists had to grow smaller to create the proper silhouette. And that meant corsets. Oh, the corsets. We have all heard about corsets, about how they crushed ribs and displaced organs. But I want you to really understand what that means, what it felt like, what it did to a body over time. A corset was made of stiffened fabric, usually canvas or cotton, reinforced with strips of whalebone or steel. It wrapped around the torso from just under the breasts to the hips, and it was tightened by laces at the back. Laces that were pulled tighter and tighter until the waist was compressed to the desired size. What was the desired size? In the 1550s, when Catherine de' Medici ruled France, she declared that no woman with a thick waist could attend court. Court records suggest she wanted waists of 13 inches. 13 inches. Put your hands around your waist right now. Imagine compressing it until it is the circumference of a large grapefruit. That was what Catherine demanded. But it was not just Catherine. Throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, tiny waists were fashionable. And fashion meant survival. So women laced their corsets tighter, and tighter, and tighter, until they could barely breathe. Until they fainted regularly, which was called the vapors, and considered almost fashionable itself, proof that you were so delicate, so refined, that you could not withstand strong emotion or tight spaces. Doctors knew what was happening. They published papers about it. They examined women and found broken ribs, displaced livers, compressed lungs, deformed spines. They documented it, wrote about it, pleaded with women to stop. And women kept lacing tighter, because a thick waist was worse than a crushed liver, because dying young was better than dying unmarried, because fashion was more powerful than medicine, more persuasive than pain, more important than health. Let me tell you about a specific case that captured my attention while researching this journey. Her name was Emilie Marie Boucher, a Parisian socialite in the 1860s, known throughout the city for her impossibly tiny waist. Reportedly 14 inches, though some claimed even smaller. She was beautiful by every standard of her time. Men wrote poems about her. Women envied her. She attended every important ball, every fashionable gathering. She was the ideal. And then, one night at the opera, she collapsed, just fell over in her seat. Her companions thought she had fainted, which was common, but when they tried to revive her, they realized something was wrong. They tried to loosen her corset, but it was laced so tightly, had been worn for so long, that the fabric had bonded with her skin in places. They could not unlace it quickly enough. By the time a doctor arrived and cut the corset off, which took precious minutes because the whalebone was thick and his knife kept slipping, Emilie had stopped breathing. The sudden release of pressure after years of compression caused what the doctor termed catastrophic organ displacement. Her liver had shifted so violently that it tore. She died within the hour. She was 23 years old. The doctor who treated her, Dr. Ludovic Leroy, was so traumatized that he spent the rest of his career campaigning against corsets. He wrote a book in 1908 called Le Corset, which included graphic medical photographs of corset damage. It showed ribs that had grown inward, penetrating lungs. It showed livers that had been pushed up into the rib cage. It showed spines curved into shapes that should not exist in nature. He gave lectures, he wrote articles, he begged women to stop. And you know what happened? Corset sales went up. Because the corset maker who made Emilie's corset used her death in their advertising. They marketed it as proof of their superior construction, strong enough to reshape even the most stubborn figure. They meant it literally. They were proud that their corset had compressed a woman's body so thoroughly that her organs could not recover from the release. And women bought those corsets. They bought them because if Emilie's corset could make her waist that small, then surely it could work for them too. Now, you might be wondering, surely not all women wore corsets that tight. Surely most women wore them more loosely, more comfortably. And you would be partly right. Working class women often wore lighter, less restrictive corsets because they actually needed to breathe while they worked. But middle and upper class women, women who did not need to do physical labor, they tightened their corsets until they could barely function. Because function was not the point. Looking correct was the point. And looking correct meant a waist small enough to span with 2 hands, preferably someone else's hands, preferably a man's hands. There are diaries and letters from Victorian women describing their daily routines. They would wake up and have their maids lace them into their corsets. The process took 15 to 30 minutes. The maid would brace her foot against the bed or a chair and pull on the laces with all her strength. The woman would hold onto a bedpost and try not to scream. Once the corset was laced, breathing became shallow. Eating became difficult. Sitting required care because sitting wrong could cause the whalebone stays to stab into flesh. And this was normal. This was daily life. This was what being a respectable woman meant. Let us leave the crushing of waists for a moment and move upward to the head, because while women's bodies were being compressed and expanded, their heads were being transformed into architectural wonders. In 18th century France, during the reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, hairstyles reached heights that seem impossible, literally impossible. Women's hair, piled and padded and pinned and powdered, could reach 3 feet tall. 3 feet. That is taller than a toddler. That is higher than most doorways. Women had to kneel in carriages to fit inside. They had to sit on the floor of sedan chairs. They could not wear hats because there was no hat large enough to fit over the hair. And they could not wash it because these hairstyles took hours to construct, required enormous amounts of false hair and padding and pomade, and were meant to last for weeks or even months. So women would maintain the same hairstyle for 6, 8, sometimes 12 weeks at a time. They would sleep sitting up or leaning forward onto special neck supports that kept the hair from touching the pillow. And because the hair was held together with pomade made from animal fat and powdered with wheat flour, because it was never washed, it became a habitat. Lice lived in these hairstyles. Mice nested in them. There are multiple documented accounts of women discovering mice living in their hair, giving birth in their hair, dying in their hair. And they did not take down the hairstyle, they just quietly removed the mouse and continued with their day. Marie Antoinette's hairdresser, a man named Léonard Autier, became a celebrity for his elaborate creations. He built scenes into women's hair, model ships to celebrate naval victories, gardens complete with flowers and butterflies, bird cages with actual small birds perched inside. He once created a hairstyle that included a working miniature windmill. The woman wearing it had to move carefully to avoid the windmill blades getting caught on things, but she wore it to a ball and was declared the most fashionable woman there. Fashion was not about beauty or elegance, it was about spectacle. It was about proving you could afford to have someone spend 5 hours building a ship into your hair. It was about showing you did not need to do anything practical, anything that might disturb the 3-foot tower balanced on your head. It was about status, about power, about who could take up the most space and require the most maintenance. And then there were the shoes. Oh, the shoes. In Renaissance Venice, wealthy women wore chopines, platform shoes that could reach 20 inches in height. 20 inches! That is nearly 2 feet of solid wood strapped to your feet. Walking in these shoes was impossible. Women needed servants on either side to support them, to essentially carry them everywhere they went. Why? Why would anyone wear shoes so tall they could not walk? Because height meant status. It meant you did not need to walk. It meant you were so important, so wealthy, so far above the common people that you could afford to be helpless. The chopines were not a design flaw. The helplessness was the design. There are records of women falling from their chopines and breaking bones, breaking necks, dying from the falls. There are records of pregnant women falling and losing their babies. The Venetian government actually passed laws limiting chopine height to 3 inches, citing the danger to women with child who, wearing these excessive shoes, do often fall and lose their pregnancies. But the laws were ignored. Women kept wearing taller and taller chopines. Because 3 inches was pedestrian, 3 inches was what servants wore. Noble women wore 20 inches, and if you could not walk, if you needed to be carried, well, that just proved you were noble enough to be carried. Let me tell you about a woman named Isabella Fioravanti, whose death in 1512 perfectly captures the danger of these shoes. Isabella was the wife of a wealthy silk merchant in Venice. She was young, beautiful, fashionable. And on a summer day in June, she was walking across a bridge near the Rialto, wearing 18-inch chopines supported by 2 servants. One of the servants stumbled, just a momentary loss of balance. But Isabella, perched on her wooden platforms, could not catch herself. She fell backward off the bridge into the canal. Now, falling into water does not sound too dangerous, does it? But Isabella was wearing approximately 30 pounds of silk clothing, and the chopines themselves were heavy. And she could not swim, because noble women did not learn to swim. Why would they need to? They had servants. So Isabella went into the water and could not surface. The weight pulled her down. By the time someone jumped in to save her, she had drowned. She was 19 years old, and she died because her shoes were too tall to walk in and her dress was too heavy to swim in, and fashion was more important than learning practical skills like how to not drown. Now let us talk about color, because even the color of your clothing could get you killed. Throughout history, certain colors were restricted to certain classes. In ancient Rome, purple was reserved for emperors and high-ranking senators. The dye was made from sea snails, required 12,000 snails to produce 1 gram of pigment, and was worth more than gold. Wearing purple without permission was considered fraud, impersonation of rank, treason. The punishment was death. There are records of men being executed for wearing purple-striped togas, not even fully purple garments, just stripes, just a trim. They died for a decorative element on their clothing. In medieval Europe, different regions had different color restrictions. In some places, peasants could not wear bright colors, only dull browns and grays. In others, certain shades of red or blue were reserved for nobility. Sumptuary laws specified exactly who could wear what, down to the inch of trim on a jacket, the width of a stripe on a skirt. And these laws were enforced. People were arrested, fined, publicly humiliated, imprisoned. There is a case from 14th century France of a wealthy merchant prosecuted for wearing a purple cloak to a royal function. His defense was that the cloak was actually very dark blue, just appearing purple in certain light. The trial lasted weeks. Fabric experts were called. The cloak was examined under different lighting conditions. Eventually, he was acquitted, but financially ruined by the legal fees. His crime was maybe wearing purple? Maybe. No one was sure, but the trial went ahead anyway. The obsession with color reached its peak in China during the Tang Dynasty, when yellow was reserved exclusively for the emperor. Not golden yellow, not pale yellow, any shade of yellow. Anyone other than the emperor wearing yellow faced execution. There are records of a merchant who wore a yellow robe to market, was reported by a neighbor, and was beheaded within 3 days. His family was exiled, his property was confiscated. For wearing yellow, for choosing the wrong color that morning. This seems insane to us now, but at the time it made perfect sense. Because if anyone could wear any color, how would you know who to bow to? How would you know who deserved respect? How would you maintain social order? Color was not just aesthetic, it was information, it was language, it was law. And then we come to the hobble skirt, which brings us into the 20th century, into the modern world, into an era when we should have known better. The hobble skirt was introduced around 1910 by French designer Paul Poiret. It was a skirt so narrow at the hem that women could barely walk. They could take steps of only 3 or 4 inches. They could not run, they could not climb stairs easily, they could not escape danger. And this was considered elegant. Poiret himself said he freed the bust but shackled the legs, and he said it with pride, as if limiting women's mobility was an achievement to celebrate. Women bought hobble skirts eagerly. They wore them to suffrage marches, to protests demanding the right to vote, demanding equality. They marched for freedom while wearing skirts designed to hobble them. The irony was not lost on everyone. Dr. Anna Shaw, a prominent suffragist, gave a speech in 1911 where she said, "Men tell us we are not fit for the vote because we are too emotional, too irrational, and then they invent a skirt that prevents us from walking and expect us to wear it. Tell me who is being irrational here?" The audience applauded. Many women in that audience were wearing hobble skirts. There were accidents, of course. Women tripped and fell. They could not catch themselves because the skirt prevented them from spreading their legs for balance. There are records of women being hit by cars and carriages because they could not move out of the way fast enough. There is a particularly haunting account from 1912 about women on the Titanic who refused to remove their hobble skirts even as the ship was sinking, even when crew members begged them to, because being seen in their undergarments was more frightening than drowning. Some eventually removed the skirts and survived. Some did not and died. Fashion mattered more than survival. Modesty mattered more than life. This is not ancient history. This was barely over a century ago. This was the modern world, and women were still dying for fashion. Now, you might be thinking, surely we have learned, surely we are smarter now, surely we do not do these things anymore. But look around. Look at what we wear, what we do to our bodies, what we consider normal. Women wear high heels that cause permanent foot damage, nerve damage, back problems. They wear shapewear that compresses organs just like corsets did. They get plastic surgery that sometimes kills them, sometimes leaves them disfigured, often causes chronic pain. They follow diets that damage their metabolism. They inject toxins into their faces. They spend hours every day on makeup and hair and clothing. They compare themselves to digitally altered images and feel inadequate. They judge each other for not meeting impossible standards. The specific methods have changed, the technology has improved, but the fundamental pattern remains. We are still sacrificing health for appearance. We are still prioritizing beauty over safety. We are still trapped by rules about how we should look, rules enforced not by law but by social pressure, by the fear of being excluded, of being judged, of being considered less than. And here is the truly maddening part. We call it choice. We say women choose to wear uncomfortable shoes, choose to diet, choose to get surgery. And yes, technically these are choices, but are they really? If the alternative to following beauty standards is social exclusion, is career damage, is being considered unattractive and therefore valueless, is that truly a free choice? Or is it just a more subtle form of coercion? The women who wore crinolines chose to wear them. The women who tightened their corsets until their ribs broke chose to tighten them. The women who wore hobble skirts chose to wear them. But they chose them because the alternative was worse, because not following fashion meant social death. And social death, in a world where women had few rights and little economic independence, often meant actual death eventually. So they chose fashion, they chose pain, they chose danger. And we judge them for it while doing exactly the same thing. Fashion has always been about power, about who gets to set the rules and who has to follow them, about who gets to be comfortable and who has to suffer. And throughout history, the pattern has been clear. Men set themselves free. They gave themselves permission to wear comfortable, practical clothing. They rejected elaborate restrictive fashion in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, in what historians call the Great Male Renunciation. Men collectively decided they were done with silk stockings and embroidered waistcoats and high heels. They switched to simple, dark suits. They chose function over form, and they never looked back. But women were not given that same permission. Women were told their value lay in their appearance, that their job was to be decorative, that suffering for beauty was noble, admirable, proof of femininity. So while men freed themselves, women were laced tighter. Their skirts grew wider, their waists smaller, their shoes taller. Men claimed comfort as masculine, and discomfort became feminine. That division still exists. Men's clothing is designed for comfort and practicality. Women's clothing is designed for appearance. Men have pockets, women have handbags. Men have flat shoes, women have heels. Men can dress in 5 minutes, women need an hour. And we pretend this is natural, biological, just the way things are. But it is not. It is constructed. It is historical. It is the result of decisions made centuries ago that we keep accepting as inevitable. So what do we do? How do we break this cycle? How do we stop repeating the same patterns, the same mistakes, the same sacrifices? I think it starts with awareness, with understanding the history, with recognizing the patterns, with asking why we believe the things we believe about appearance and worth. It starts with questioning whose interests are served when we feel bad about our bodies. Who profits when we buy products to fix problems we did not know we had until advertising told us? Who benefits when we spend our time and money and energy on appearance instead of education, career, political organizing, building power? It starts with rejecting the premise that appearance determines worth, with refusing to judge ourselves and others by impossible standards, with choosing comfort when we can, with being kind to ourselves and each other, with recognizing that the beauty standards we are chasing are not natural or inevitable, but constructed and historical, and designed to serve purposes that have nothing to do with our well-being. And it continues with making different choices, not necessarily all at once, not necessarily perfectly, but consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of what we are choosing and why. Maybe that means wearing comfortable shoes sometimes, even when they are not fashionable. Maybe it means buying less and keeping clothes longer. Maybe it means questioning whether you really need that waist trainer or that procedure or that product. Maybe it means being kinder to yourself about appearance. Maybe it means refusing to judge others for their fashion choices. Maybe it just means pausing before you buy something or wear something or judge someone and asking why. Why does this matter? What am I trying to achieve? Is it worth it? Because here is what history teaches us. The specific fashions change, but the patterns do not. We keep repeating the same mistakes because we keep accepting the same premises. The premise that appearance determines worth, that suffering for beauty is noble, that conforming to impossible standards is necessary for acceptance, that we have to choose between being comfortable and being acceptable. These premises are lies. They have always been lies, but they are useful lies for people who profit from our insecurity and our willingness to suffer. The only way to break the cycle is to reject the premises. To say, my worth is not determined by my waist size or my shoe height or how well I conform to current beauty standards. My worth is determined by who I am, what I do, how I treat people, what I contribute to the world. And I refuse to sacrifice my health, my comfort, my resources, or my freedom for the sake of appearance. That is hard to do. The pressures are real. The social consequences of not conforming are real. The judgment is real. But the consequences of conforming are also real. The discomfort is real. The limitation is real. The exploitation is real. The damage to our bodies, our minds, our planet, and the people who make our clothes is real. We have to choose which set of consequences we are willing to live with. And whatever you choose, choose it consciously. Choose it with full awareness of the history, the patterns, the trade-offs. Do not just go along with what fashion dictates because everyone else is doing it, because that is how we got here. That is how we ended up with crinolines that killed thousands, with corsets that deformed bodies, with laws that executed people for wearing the wrong color. Unconscious conformity to harmful norms is the real enemy. Not fashion itself, but the mindless acceptance of whatever fashion demands. Unconscious conformity to harmful norms is the real enemy. As you drift towards sleep now, as your breathing slows and your muscles relax, I want you to think about one thing. What would it feel like to be truly comfortable? Not just physically comfortable, though that is part of it, but comfortable with yourself, comfortable in your own skin, comfortable making choices based on what you want rather than what other people expect. What would it feel like to opt out of the competition, to stop comparing yourself to impossible standards, to choose comfort over appearance, function over form, authenticity over conformity? I think it would feel like freedom, real freedom, the kind women have been fighting for throughout history while wearing skirts that prevented them from fighting effectively. Maybe it is time we took off the metaphorical hobble skirt. Maybe it is time we stopped crushing ourselves into corsets of other people's expectations. Maybe it is time we stopped sacrificing ourselves on the altar of fashion. Maybe it is time we just breathed deeply, moved freely, existed comfortably in our own bodies without needing special chairs or modified doorways or 3 servants to help us get dressed. That would be something. That would be revolutionary. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the burning dresses and crushing corsets, through the towering wigs and impossible shoes, through every absurd, dangerous, ridiculous thing humans have done in the name of fashion. I hope you see the patterns now. I hope you recognize them in your own life. And I hope you make different choices. Not because anyone is telling you what to wear or how to look, but because you deserve to be comfortable. You deserve to breathe fully. You deserve to move freely. You deserve to make choices based on what is good for you, not what fashion demands. The women who died for fashion did not have the knowledge we have now. They did not have the historical perspective. They did not know the patterns would repeat. We do know. We have seen it all now. We understand the cycle. So the question is, what are we going to do with that knowledge? Sleep well, sleep deeply, and remember, sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply sit down comfortably. Good night. If you have ever wondered how a single flower could reshape civilizations, topple empires, and rewrite the course of human suffering and solace, then settle in beneath your blankets and let the story unfold. Tonight, we trace the winding path of the opium poppy, from its humble origins in ancient Mesopotamian fields to the crisis that grips nations in our modern age. This is not merely a tale of medicine or vice, but rather a chronicle of humanity itself, our eternal search for relief from pain, our capacity for both healing and destruction, and the delicate line we walk between wisdom and folly. If you find comfort in these long nocturnal journeys through history, consider staying with us for more tales that drift through the shadows of the past. Now dim the lights, let the world outside fade to a gentle murmur, and allow yourself to be carried back through 5,000 years of human experience. Imagine yourself standing in the cradle of civilization, somewhere between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the sun beats down upon fields of barley and the air shimmers with desert heat. The year is approximately 3,500 years before the Common Era, and you are a Sumerian, your life woven into the rhythms of planting and harvest, of temple rituals, and the eternal dance between survival and starvation. Your beard is magnificent, your sandals worn thin by the dusty paths between your mud brick home and the fields where you toil. One morning, as the sun climbs above the horizon and paints the landscape in shades of amber and gold, you notice something unusual growing among the wild grasses at the edge of your plot. A flower, scarlet petals trembling in the breeze, stands taller than the common weeds, its presence somehow both delicate and commanding. If you find comfort in these long nocturnal journeys through history, consider staying with us for more tales that drift through the shadows of the past. Now dim the lights, let the world outside fade to a gentle murmur, and allow yourself to be carried back through 5,000 years of human experience. You approach this flower with curiosity, for in an age without books or schools, knowledge comes through observation and careful experimentation. The poppy, as you will come to know it, is not native to these lands alone, but it thrives here in the dry heat, asking little from the soil and offering much in return. You break open one of the seed pods, and a milky sap oozes forth, sticky and fragrant, coating your fingers with a substance that smells of earth and something else, something you cannot quite name. Perhaps it is the scent of dreams themselves. You taste it cautiously, for you have learned that nature offers both nourishment and poison in equal measure. The flavor is bitter, unpleasant even, but within moments something shifts inside you. The ache in your lower back, the constant companion of your laboring days, seems to retreat into the distance. The hunger that gnaws at your belly becomes somehow less urgent. The crying of your neighbor's infant, which has pierced the air for 3 days without cease, now sounds almost musical, a distant lullaby rather than a torment. The Sumerians, your people, give this plant a name that will echo through the millennia. They call it Hul-gil, which translates to the joy plant, and rarely has a name been more fitting or more ominous. In the temples where priests commune with gods whose moods are as changeable as the weather, the poppy begins to occupy a place of honor. It is grown in sacred gardeners alongside the grain that sustains the body, for the priests recognize that sustenance comes in many forms. Clay tablets, those earliest attempts to capture human thought and preserve it beyond the limits of memory, begin to record the uses of this remarkable plant. remedies for sleeplessness, for the deep sadness that sometimes descends upon the soul without warning, for the pains of the body that make each day a trial. The scribes press their wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, and in doing so they create the first prescriptions, the first medical records of humanity's dance with the poppy. But knowledge, like the wind, does not respect borders or remain confined to a single place. The merchants who travel the rivers, carrying goods from city to city, from kingdom to kingdom, these early traders become the vectors of transmission for this botanical secret. Picture them, these bearded men with weathered faces and sharp eyes, loading their reed boats with jars of grain, bolts of woven cloth, and tucked discreetly among the cargo, small packets of dried poppy sap. They sail northward toward Anatolia, westward toward the Mediterranean coast, and everywhere they stop, they speak in hushed tones of this miracle substance from the south. Try this, they say, and funerals become bearable. Try this, and the grief that threatens to swallow you whole becomes something you can carry. Within a handful of generations, the poppy has spread across the known world like a whispered secret that everyone wants to hear. In Egypt, where the pharaohs rule from golden thrones and the dead are prepared for eternity with more care than the living, opium finds a new home. The Egyptians, never a people to do things by half measures, do not simply use the poppy as the Sumerians did. They refine it, ritualize it, and transform it into something that fits their cosmology of death and rebirth. Try this, they say, and funerals become bearable. Try this, and the grief that threatens to swallow you whole becomes something you can carry. Within a handful of generations, the poppy has spread across the known world like a whispered secret that everyone wants to hear. In Egypt, where the pharaohs rule from golden thrones and the dead are prepared for eternity with more care than the living, opium finds a new home. The Egyptians, never a people to do things by half measures, do not simply use the poppy as the Sumerians did. They refine it, ritualize it, and transform it into something that fits their cosmology of death and rebirth. They mix the sap with wine, creating elixirs that ease the pain of the dying and accompany the dead into their tombs, provisions for a journey beyond the reach of mortal understanding. The goddess Hathor, patroness of joy and music and intoxication, becomes associated with these preparations, and suddenly opium is not merely medicine but something touched by the divine. In the great houses of Thebes and Memphis, physicians with shaved heads and linen kilts begin to experiment with dosages and delivery methods. They record their findings on papyrus scrolls, noting which combinations work for which ailments, which strengths are appropriate for children and which for adults, though their understanding of safety is, by modern standards, terrifyingly optimistic. A typical entry might read, Day 4, patient continues to experience relief from back pain, though he now believes himself to be a crocodile and has attempted to live in the reflecting pool. Adjustment of dosage recommended. These early medical texts, part science and part hopeful guessing, establish protocols that will influence healing practices for thousands of years to come. The Assyrians, those fierce warriors who carve their victories into stone and brook no weakness, adopt opium with enthusiasm that borders on recklessness. They use it not only as a painkiller, but as a cure for hangovers, that universal human affliction that transcends culture and epoch. After nights of feasting and drinking beer that is more nutrition than intoxication, the Assyrian nobles wake to pounding heads and queasy stomachs, and they reach for the poppy, mixing it into morning tonics that allow them to face the day with something approaching dignity. The line between medicine and habit begins to blur, though no one has yet coined a word for addiction, and the concept remains as hazy as the smoke from oil lamps. By the time the Greeks enter this narrative, opium has become so widespread that it appears in their mythology and their medicine with equal prominence. Hippocrates, that towering figure who is often called the father of medicine, though he would likely be baffled and appalled by much of what modern medicine has become, includes opium in his pharmacopoeia. He prescribes it for ailments of the stomach, for melancholy, for the existential dread that comes from spending too much time thinking about death, which in ancient Greece is practically a national pastime. The Greeks, ever philosophers, contemplate the nature of the relief that opium brings. Is it true healing, they wonder, or merely the masking of symptoms? Is the peace it brings genuine or illusory? These questions, asked 25 centuries ago, remain unanswered today. In the symposiums where Greek men recline on couches and debate the nature of reality while getting progressively more intoxicated, opium sometimes makes an appearance, mixed into the wine that fuels these philosophical marathons. The combination of alcohol and opium creates a state of consciousness that the participants describe as touched by the gods, a feeling of profound insight and connection that, in the clear light of morning, often proves to have been mostly nonsense. But in the moment, lying beneath painted ceilings and surrounded by the murmur of conversation, the partakers feel that they have glimpsed something true and beautiful beyond the veil of ordinary perception. It is perhaps the first recorded instance of humans using opiates not out of medical necessity, but in search of transcendence, a pattern that will repeat throughout history with varying degrees of success and catastrophe. Then come the Romans, and if the Greeks approached opium with philosophical curiosity, the Romans embrace it with their characteristic combination of engineering precision and complete lack of moderation. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Rome has grown from a collection of hills beside the Tiber into an empire that spans 3 continents. And with that growth comes both the wealth to indulge in exotic luxuries and the stress of managing an unwieldy colossus of conquest and bureaucracy. Opium, now called meconium in Latin, becomes as common in Roman households as olive oil or garum, that fermented fish sauce that Romans put on everything despite its smell suggesting that something has died and been forgotten in a jar. Roman physicians, most notably Galen, who serves as doctor to emperors and gladiators alike, write extensively about opium and its applications. Galen's medical texts, which will be considered authoritative for more than 1,000 years, include detailed instructions for using opium to treat headaches, insomnia, grief, dysentery, and what he describes as excessive emotional sensitivity, which seems to mean any feeling at all. His advice, use sparingly, is immediately ignored by almost everyone who reads it. Romans being Romans, they interpret medical guidelines as suggestions rather than rules, and soon opium is being added to bathwater, mixed into face creams, and incorporated into the kind of elaborate dinner parties where peacock tongues are served on silver platters and senators compete to see who can recline most languidly while discussing the finer points of Stoic philosophy. The Roman pharmacies, which line the forums of every major city, stock opium in various forms. There are powders to be mixed with wine, sticky black cakes to be dissolved in water, and ointments for rubbing into sore muscles or aching joints. The vendors, many of whom learned their trade through apprenticeship rather than formal education, dispense these substances with a casual confidence that would horrify modern pharmacists. A customer might walk in complaining of a stubbed toe and walk out with enough opium to tranquilize a war elephant, along with cheerful instructions to take it thrice daily until the moon is full or the toe stops throbbing, whichever comes first. Of course, not everyone in Rome is enthusiastic about this widespread embrace of opium. The Stoics, those philosophers who believe that virtue consists in accepting whatever fate brings without complaint or emotional excess, view reliance on external substances for inner peace as a kind of weakness. They argue, not unreasonably, that true strength comes from within, from the cultivation of rational thought and emotional resilience, not from drinking tinctures that make you forget why you were upset in the first place. But their voices, crying out for temperance and self-control, are largely drowned out by the majority who have discovered that life is simply more pleasant when filtered through a gentle opiate haze. After all, the Romans reason, if the gods had not wanted humans to use opium, why would they have created it in the first place? This logic, deeply flawed but emotionally satisfying, carries the day. As Rome's influence spreads across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, so too does knowledge of opium. Legionnaires carry it in their packs, using it to treat battlefield injuries when proper surgical care is unavailable, or when the army surgeons, who are often recruited based on their willingness to saw through bone rather than any particular skill, prove more dangerous than the original wound. Merchants include it among the goods they trade, and slowly, steadily, the poppy puts down roots in new soils and new cultures, adapting to each place it arrives while retaining its essential nature, beautiful, useful, and quietly dangerous in ways that will not become fully apparent for centuries yet to come. Now let us travel eastward, beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, to the vast network of trade routes that history will come to call the Silk Road. This is not a single road, but rather a web of paths stretching from the Mediterranean coast through Persia and Central Asia all the way to China, a distance so immense that few travelers ever complete the entire journey. Along these routes, carried on the backs of camels and horses, in the holds of ships that sail coastal waters, and in the packs of traders who speak a dozen languages and trust no one fully, move goods of every description. Silk from China, glassware from Syria, spices from India, and tucked among these more celebrated commodities, often unlisted on official manifests and undeclared to customs officials, opium. You are one of these merchants, let us say. A man of middle years with a sunburned face and a talent for negotiation that has kept you alive and reasonably prosperous despite the dangers inherent in your profession. Bandits haunt the mountain passes, demanding tribute or taking it by force. Officials at every border post expect bribes, the amount varying based on their assessment of your wealth and your willingness to argue. The weather itself seems determined to kill you, with sandstorms that strip skin from bone and winter cold that turns fingers black with frostbite. And yet you persist because the profits, for those clever and lucky enough to survive, are extraordinary. Your caravan consists of 30 camels, 15 men, and enough supplies to last 3 months if rationed carefully, or 2 months if morale needs boosting. Among your official cargo are bolts of silk, bags of peppercorns that are worth their weight in silver, and carefully wrapped porcelain that will shatter if anyone looks at it wrong. But hidden beneath these legitimate goods, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into false bottoms of packing crates, are your real valuables. Opium, processed into dense cakes that can be broken into smaller pieces, each worth enough to live on for a month. You acquired these from a supplier in Persia, a Greek man with too many rings and a smile that never quite reaches his eyes, who assured you that the quality is exceptional and the price is fair, both of which are probably lies, but lies you can work with. At every stop along your route, you engage in a careful dance with customs officials. They inspect your goods, noting the silk and spices on their lists, assessing the appropriate taxes. When they come to the wrapped packages of opium, you explain calmly that these are medicinal compounds, herbal remedies for various ailments, which is technically true in the same way that a sword is technically a farming implement if you are creative enough about it. The officials nod, unconvinced but willing to be convinced, and you offer them a sample, just a small taste so they can verify the quality themselves. 10 minutes later, they are giggling at their own shadows and waving you through the checkpoint with expressions of profound benevolence toward all living things. This scene repeats itself across Central Asia with minor variations. In Samarkand, you trade silk for dried fruits and fresh horses. In Bukhara, you spend 3 days in a caravanserai, one of those fortified inns that dot the trade routes, waiting out a sandstorm and listening to other merchants tell lies about their profits. A scholar from Baghdad buys some of your lower-grade opium, claiming he needs it for his studies of consciousness and the nature of perception. A musician purchases a small amount, insisting it helps him hear the music of the spheres, though to your ear he still plays out of tune. And then, quietly, late at night in your rented room, a man in fine robes who identifies himself only as a servant of someone important slips you a gold coin and asks for your best quality opium, the kind reserved for those who can afford to chase their pain all the way into oblivion. The deeper into Asia you travel, the more you notice that opium is no longer a foreign curiosity, but a familiar presence. In India, farmers have begun cultivating their own poppies, and the local markets sell opium paste alongside turmeric and cardamom. In the mountains of Afghanistan, where the soil is poor for most crops but apparently perfect for poppies, entire villages have organized their economies around this single plant. The Buddhist monasteries you pass, perched on cliffsides and wreathed in clouds, smell of incense smoke that might be entirely innocent, or might contain other substances that aid in meditation and the dissolution of the self. You do not ask, and the monks do not volunteer information, and this mutual discretion allows commerce to proceed smoothly. By the time you reach China, having crossed deserts and mountains and said goodbye to 3 camels and one man who simply vanished one night, leaving only his boots behind, you find that the Chinese have their own relationship with opium, one that is beginning to concern their government even as it enriches merchants and suppliers. The upper classes, those scholars and officials who govern the vast bureaucracy of the empire, have taken to mixing opium into their tea, claiming that it enhances clarity of thought and aids in the composition of poetry. Whether their poetry actually improves is debatable, but they certainly become more prolific, writing odes to chrysanthemums and the moon with an enthusiasm that borders on manic. You sell your remaining opium to a merchant in Canton, receiving in return a quantity of silver that represents more wealth than your father saw in his entire lifetime. You count the coins carefully, convert some into letters of credit that can be redeemed in Persia, and allow yourself one night of celebration before beginning the long journey home. As you sit in a tea house, listening to a musician play a stringed instrument you cannot name, you reflect on the strange path your life has taken. You traffic in a substance that brings relief and pleasure and problems in roughly equal measure, and while you do not consider yourself a moral man, neither do you think of yourself as evil. You are simply a link in a very long chain that stretches back thousands of years and will surely continue long after you have become dust. The poppy does not care about your philosophy or your nighttime doubts. It simply grows, blooms, and produces its precious sap, and humanity, ever resourceful and ever foolish, finds endless uses for it. Now let us shift our view to the Islamic world during its Golden Age, that remarkable period from roughly the 8th to the 13th centuries, when the cities of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba became the intellectual centers of the world. Here, while Europe languishes in what future generations will call the Dark Ages, scholars preserve and expand upon the knowledge of the ancients. They translate Greek and Roman texts into Arabic, add their own observations and discoveries, and create a synthesis of learning that encompasses mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. And in this flowering of human knowledge, opium occupies an important but carefully considered place. You are a court physician in Baghdad during the reign of the Abbasid caliphs, a position that requires not only medical knowledge but also political acumen, for the line between healer and scapegoat can be dangerously thin. Your medical training included years of study under established masters, memorizing texts, observing treatments, and gradually being allowed to treat patients under supervision. You have learned to set bones, to diagnose fevers based on the color and consistency of urine, to prepare compounds from hundreds of different plants and minerals. And among your most valuable tools is opium, which you keep in a locked cabinet alongside other powerful and potentially dangerous substances. The Islamic approach to opium reflects the broader philosophical and religious context of the culture. The Quran forbids intoxication, declaring that substances which befog the mind and interfere with prayer and right action are to be avoided. But opium, when used medicinally and in appropriate doses, occupies a gray area. It is not consumed for pleasure, at least not officially, but rather to alleviate suffering, which is surely a pious goal. The scholars debate the fine points. If a patient takes opium for pain and experiences a sense of euphoria as a side effect, has he sinned? If a person becomes dependent on opium for legitimate medical reasons, is this a moral failing or simply an unfortunate consequence of the treatment? These discussions fill volumes and resolve nothing definitively, but they demonstrate a level of thoughtfulness about drug use that is largely absent in other cultures of the period. Avicenna, known in Arabic as Ibn Sina, is perhaps the most influential physician of this era, a man whose medical encyclopedia will be used in European universities for 600 years. In his writings, he discusses opium extensively, describing its effects, its uses, and its dangers. He recommends it for severe pain, for certain types of cough, for diarrhea and dysentery, and for conditions that we might now recognize as symptoms of mental illness, though he understands them in terms of imbalances of the bodily humors. His crucial advice is to use opium wisely, by which he means sparingly and with clear medical justification, a guideline that is much easier to state than to follow. In your own practice, you find yourself walking this fine line constantly. A merchant comes to you complaining of headaches so severe that he cannot work, cannot sleep, cannot function. You prepare a tincture of opium mixed with other herbs to mask the bitter taste. Instruct him to take a small spoonful each evening and warn him not to exceed this dose. He returns 2 weeks later, the headaches improved, but now requesting more of the medicine because he has discovered that it also helps him sleep and soothes his anxieties about his business. You refill his prescription, but with misgivings, sensing that you are not curing him so much as substituting one problem for another. The hospitals, or bimaristans, that are built in major Islamic cities during this period are architectural and institutional marvels. They have separate wards for different types of illness, gardens where patients can rest and recover, and staff that includes physicians, surgeons, pharmacists, and attendants. In the wing devoted to those suffering from mental disturbances, opium is used to calm patients who might otherwise harm themselves or others. And while this is certainly more humane than chaining them in dark cells, which is the European approach during the same period, it is not without its own problems. Some patients become so sedated that they exist in a twilight state, neither fully present nor entirely absent, and you wonder sometimes if this is truly better than the alternative. Outside the formal medical establishment, opium circulates in ways that are harder to track and control. Travelers bring it from India and Persia, merchants sell it in markets alongside more conventional wares, and in the private homes of the wealthy, it appears at gatherings where men discuss poetry and philosophy late into the night. The use is generally discreet, for there is social stigma attached to being known as someone who cannot function without chemical assistance, but it happens nonetheless. You hear stories, always secondhand and impossible to verify, of entire households where everyone from the master to the servants partake daily, where the work slows to a dreamy crawl and no one seems particularly concerned about it. The moral weight of your profession settles heavily on your shoulders some nights as you sit in your study, surrounded by texts in Arabic and Greek and Persian, trying to reconcile your desire to relieve suffering with your awareness that the tools you use can themselves cause harm. Medicine, you have come to understand, is not a pure science, but an art of compromise, of weighing benefits against risks, of making decisions with incomplete information, and hoping that you have done more good than damage. The poppy, beautiful and deadly, merciful and merciless, sits at the heart of this ambiguity. It is perhaps the perfect symbol of the medical endeavor itself, the attempt to intervene in natural processes and alter outcomes, an attempt that sometimes succeeds brilliantly and sometimes fails catastrophically, and often does a bit of both simultaneously. As the Islamic Golden Age gradually fades, worn down by invasions and internal conflicts and the simple entropy that affects all human civilizations, the knowledge preserved and created during this period does not vanish. It flows westward into Europe, carried by scholars and traders, and it will help spark the Renaissance, that rediscovery of learning and art that transforms European culture. And with that knowledge comes opium, old friend and old enemy, ready to shape a new chapter of history. Let us turn now to medieval Europe, that long period stretching from the fall of Rome to the beginnings of the modern world, a time when life is, in the famous phrase, nasty, brutish, and short, and when medical care is part faith-healing, part guesswork, and part desperate hope. You are a monk in a monastery somewhere in what will eventually be called France, though in your time it is simply the territory of whichever lord or king currently claims authority over this particular patch of muddy fields and drafty castles. Your days follow a rhythm established by prayer and work. You rise before dawn to sing lauds, spend the morning hours copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, tend the monastery garden in the afternoon, and gather again for vespers as the sun sets. It is a life of routine and relative peace, isolated from the chaos that frequently engulfs the secular world beyond your walls. Among your many responsibilities is serving as the monastery healer, a role that fell to you not because of any particular aptitude or training, but simply because you could read Latin, and the previous monk who held this position died last winter of a fever that you were powerless to treat. Your medical knowledge comes from a few ancient texts, copied and recopied until the errors have multiplied beyond counting, and from the oral tradition passed down by healers, who themselves learned from other healers in an unbroken chain stretching back to antiquity. It is not much to work with, but it is what you have, and so you do your best. The monastery garden contains the usual herbs and plants that any medieval healer would cultivate: lavender for calming the nerves, rosemary for improving memory, chamomile for stomach ailments, and tucked in a corner where it receives full sun and is tended with particular care, a small patch of opium poppies. The abbot, a practical man who understands that idealism must sometimes bend before necessity, has given his blessing to growing these flowers, reasoning that if God placed healing plants on earth, it would be ungrateful not to use them. The fact that church authorities in Rome might take a dimmer view of this logic is a problem for another day, assuming Rome ever finds out, which it almost certainly will not, given that you are hundreds of miles from the nearest bishop and communication is sporadic at best. When a patient comes to you in pain, whether from an injury or illness or simply the accumulated damage of a hard life, you have limited options. You can offer prayer, which costs nothing and occasionally seems to help, though whether through divine intervention or the placebo effect is beyond your ability to determine. You can apply poultices and ointments, hoping that the body's natural healing processes will take care of the rest. Or, for more severe cases, you can prepare an opium tincture, grinding the dried poppy heads into powder and steeping them in wine or ale until the liquid takes on a dark color and bitter taste. This remedy you dispense with a mixture of confidence and trepidation, for while you have seen it work wonders, easing pain and allowing sleep when nothing else would, you have also seen its dangers. A knight arrives at your gate one morning, having been unhorsed during a tournament and broken several ribs in the fall. He is pale with pain, each breath of visible agony, and his companions beg you to do something, anything to help him. You prepare a strong dose of your poppy tincture, warning him that it will make him drowsy and possibly cause strange dreams, and you watch as he drinks it down with a grimace. Within a quarter hour, his face relaxes, the lines of pain smoothing away, and he falls into a deep sleep from which he does not wake for 12 hours. When he does finally open his eyes, he reports that the pain is much reduced and asks if you might have more of that marvelous medicine. You provide a weaker dose and counsel him to use it sparingly, advice that he accepts with the kind of easy agreement that makes you suspect he is not truly listening. Over the following weeks, as the knight recovers in the monastery's guest house, he requests the tincture with increasing frequency. At first, he claims continued pain from his ribs, then difficulty sleeping, then a vague malaise that he cannot quite describe. You recognize what is happening, for you have seen it before, the way that opium's relief becomes its own kind of necessity, but you are unsure how to refuse him. He is a man of rank and violence, accustomed to getting what he wants, and you are a monk who has forsworn physical confrontation. In the end, you compromise, providing smaller doses and mixing in other herbs that you hope will reduce the strength of the opium without him noticing. Whether this strategy works or merely delays the inevitable, you cannot say. The challenge you face, and it is a challenge that will echo across centuries, is that opium genuinely helps people. It is not a fraud or a false promise, but a medicine that delivers on its claims, easing pain and bringing rest to those who suffer. The problem is that this relief comes with a cost that is not immediately apparent, a debt that accumulates silently until one day the user discovers that they can no longer function without the drug, that the absence of opium is more unbearable than the original pain ever was. And what then? You have no treatment for dependence, no understanding of the physical and psychological mechanisms at work. You can offer only prayer and encouragement to endure, which feel pitifully inadequate in the face of actual withdrawal symptoms. In the evenings, when your duties are complete and you have a few moments for reflection, you sometimes sit in the garden near the poppies and contemplate the mystery of God's creation. Why would the divine place such a plant in the world, something capable of both mercy and destruction? Is it a test of human wisdom and moderation? Is it an example of how even good things become harmful when taken to excess? Or is it simply evidence that the world is more complicated than simple moral categories can encompass, that creation contains multitudes and contradictions, and that humans must navigate these complexities as best they can, with imperfect knowledge and good intentions? You do not reach any firm conclusions, but the questions themselves feel important, worth asking even if answers remain elusive. Centuries pass, and Europe stumbles toward modernity. The Renaissance brings new ways of thinking about the world, new attention to empirical observation and individual experience. Art and science begin to emerge from under the shadow of religious authority, though that shadow remains long and dark in many places. And in this flowering of human creativity and inquiry, opium finds new applications and new users among those who consider themselves at the forefront of civilization's advance. You are now in 16th century Venice, that impossible city built on wooden pilings driven into mud, where east meets west, and fortunes are made and lost with every tide. The streets, or rather the canals, bustle with commerce. Ships from all over the Mediterranean dock at the quays, their holds filled with goods from places most Venetians will never visit. The city is rich, confident, corrupt, beautiful, and dangerous in equal measure. It is an intoxicating place in both the metaphorical and increasingly literal sense, for Venice has become a center for the trade in exotic substances, including opium and its various preparations. You have stubbed your toe, which sounds like a trivial injury, but has left you limping and cursing with remarkable creativity. Perhaps you were distracted by the sight of a pretty face in a passing gondola, or perhaps you simply did not see the raised threshold of a door, worn smooth by centuries of feet passing over it. Regardless, your toe throbs with a pain that seems entirely disproportionate to the cause, and you make your way to the nearest apothecary seeking relief. The shop is a cave of wonders, its shelves lined with jars and bottles containing substances from all corners of the known world. The apothecary himself is a man of indeterminate age, with spectacles perched on his nose and ink stains on his fingers, suggesting that he spends as much time keeping records as mixing medicines. You explain your injury, and he nods sagely, disappearing into the back room and returning with a small vial of amber liquid. The shop is a cave of wonders, its shelves lined with jars and bottles containing substances from all corners of the known world. The apothecary himself is a man of indeterminate age, with spectacles perched on his nose and ink stains on his fingers, suggesting that he spends as much time keeping records as mixing medicines. You explain your injury, and he nods sagely, disappearing into the back room and returning with a small vial of amber liquid. This, he explains, is laudanum, a preparation invented by the great physician Paracelsus, consisting of opium dissolved in wine or brandy, along with various herbs and spices to improve the flavor and, supposedly, the effectiveness. He instructs you to take a small sip, no more than a teaspoonful, and assures you that your pain will soon vanish. You pay his fee, which is steep but not unreasonable given that you are in considerable discomfort, and you take your medicine right there in the shop, eager for relief. The taste is complex, bitter and sweet and burning all at once, and it leaves a warmth in your chest as it descends. At first, nothing happens, and you wonder if you have been cheated, but then gradually you notice that the throbbing in your toe is receding, being replaced by a gentle warmth that seems to spread through your entire body. The pain does not disappear entirely, but it becomes distant, something happening to someone else, and you feel a loosening of tension that you had not even realized you were carrying. Your shoulders drop, your jaw unclenches, and the world suddenly seems a more benign place than it did moments ago. You leave the apothecary feeling remarkably good, all things considered, and you find yourself unusually chatty with strangers, explaining your philosophy of life to a confused gondolier and complimenting a market vendor on the profound beauty of her cabbages. By the time you reach home, you are convinced that you have discovered something remarkable, a medicine that not only addresses physical pain, but also improves one's entire outlook on life. Over the following days, you find excuses to take more laudanum. Your toe still hurts, you tell yourself, and even after it heals, you discover other ailments that surely require treatment. A headache, difficulty sleeping, a vague sense of unease about the political situation. The apothecary is happy to refill your vials, and you are happy to pay him, and together you engage in a transaction that feels entirely innocent and reasonable to both parties. Laudanum becomes the wonder drug of the Renaissance and early modern period, spreading across Europe with remarkable speed. It is prescribed by physicians, sold by apothecaries, and carried in the pockets of nobles and commoners alike. The preparation is reasonably standardized, unlike the wildly variable opium tinctures of earlier eras, which means that doses are somewhat more predictable, though still subject to considerable variation depending on the strength of the opium used and the ratio of ingredients. Medical texts begin to include laudanum as a standard treatment for a vast array of conditions, from purely physical ailments like coughs and dysentery to psychological troubles like melancholy and anxiety. The problem, which takes some time to become widely recognized, is that laudanum is quite addictive. The opium dissolved in alcohol creates a particularly potent combination, and users find that they quickly develop tolerance, requiring larger doses to achieve the same effects. Withdrawal is unpleasant, characterized by sweating, shaking, nausea, and a desperate craving for more of the drug. But because addiction is not yet understood as a medical condition, those who become dependent are often seen as morally weak, lacking in willpower and self-control. The idea that the substance itself has altered their brain chemistry in ways that make it extraordinarily difficult to stop using is not yet part of medical or popular understanding. Artists and writers are particularly drawn to laudanum and other opium preparations. They claim, with varying degrees of justification, that these substances enhance creativity, allowing them to access parts of their minds that are normally closed off. The Romantic poets, who will dominate English literature in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, are notorious for their opium use. Samuel Taylor Coleridge writes Kubla Khan during an opium reverie, though he is interrupted before finishing and later claims he can no longer remember how the poem was supposed to end. Thomas de Quincey publishes Confessions of an English Opium Eater, a work that is part autobiography, part drug memoir, and part philosophical meditation on consciousness and addiction. It becomes a bestseller, and whether it serves as a warning or an advertisement is open to interpretation, for after its publication, laudanum sales increase rather than decrease. The royal courts of Europe are not immune to opium's charms. It is rumored, though rarely confirmed, that various monarchs and nobles use opium preparations, either for legitimate medical reasons or simply because they find it makes the tedium of state functions more bearable. Queen Elizabeth I of England reportedly keeps laudanum on hand for her nerves, and French nobles sometimes add it to their perfumes, creating a heady scent that combines floral notes with the earthy undertone of opium. It becomes fashionable in some circles to be slightly hazy, to speak in dreamy tones and gaze at middle distances, and while overt intoxication is frowned upon, a gentle fog is considered rather artistic and interesting. But even as opium becomes more socially accepted and widely used in Europe, trouble is brewing far to the east in the ancient empire of China. The story of opium's impact on China is one of the darkest chapters in the plant's long history, a tale of cynical economics, colonial exploitation, and human suffering on a massive scale. To understand what happens, we must first understand the economic relationship between China and the West in the 18th and early 19th centuries. China, during this period, is ruled by the Qing dynasty, and it is, by most measures, the wealthiest and most populous nation on Earth. The Chinese produce goods that Europeans desperately want, particularly tea, which has become an essential part of British culture, consumed by all classes from the poorest laborers to the royal family. They also export silk and porcelain, luxury items that fetch high prices in European markets. The problem, from the European perspective, is that China has little interest in anything Europe produces. The Chinese already have all the manufactured goods they need, their crafts are generally of higher quality than European equivalents, and their culture views foreign products as barbarous and inferior. As a result, European merchants must pay for Chinese goods with silver, and this constant outflow of precious metal is becoming an economic problem, particularly for Britain. The British East India Company, a private corporation that effectively rules large parts of India as a colonial possession, identifies a solution to this trade imbalance. India, under British control, is an ideal place to grow opium poppies. The climate is suitable, the labor is cheap and essentially coerced, and the company has the power to force farmers to grow poppies instead of food crops. The opium thus produced is shipped to China and sold, often through smugglers and corrupt officials, since the Chinese government has banned opium imports. And the silver paid by Chinese buyers is then used to purchase tea and other goods. It is a triangular trade route that benefits British merchants enormously while creating addiction and social chaos in China. Over the past several years, you have noticed disturbing changes in your jurisdiction. Opium use, which was once confined to a small number of the very wealthy who could afford to import it for medicinal use, has spread dramatically. Opium dens have opened in the cities, establishments where men, and increasingly women, lie on wooden platforms, smoking opium through long pipes and drifting in narcotic dreams. Productivity has declined as workers spend less time at their jobs and more time chasing the next dose of smoke. Tax revenues have fallen because money that would have been spent on goods and services is now spent on opium. Even some of your own staff, you suspect, are users, which would explain their increasing lethargy and unreliability. You send reports to the imperial court describing the situation and recommending action. The emperor, who has heard similar reports from officials across the country, issues an edict banning opium importation and use. The penalty for trafficking in opium is to be death, and officials are ordered to confiscate and destroy any opium they find. You implement these orders enthusiastically, organizing public burnings of seized opium and arresting dealers. For a brief moment, you feel that the problem is being addressed, that the tide of addiction can be reversed through firm action. But the British merchants have no intention of giving up such a lucrative trade. They work with corrupt Chinese officials, bribing them to look the other way. And they operate through a network of Chinese smugglers who take the risks while the foreigners remain safely offshore. The flow of opium into China not only continues but increases, and you realize with growing horror that you are fighting a losing battle. For every shipment you intercept, 5 more get through. For every dealer you arrest, 10 more take his place. The sheer scale of the problem is overwhelming, and you begin to suspect that powerful forces are working against you, forces with more resources and fewer scruples than you possess. In desperation, the emperor appoints a special commissioner, Lin Zexu, and gives him extraordinary powers to solve the opium crisis. Commissioner Lin is incorruptible, energetic, and absolutely committed to ending the opium trade. He travels to Canton, the main port of entry for foreign merchants, and he demands that all foreign traders surrender their opium stocks. When they refuse, he essentially holds them hostage, surrounding the foreign quarter with troops and cutting off food supplies until they comply. Eventually, the British merchants hand over more than 20,000 chests of opium, each chest containing about 60 kilograms, a staggering quantity worth millions of pounds. Commissioner Lin has all of it destroyed, mixed with lime and salt and flushed into the sea in what is perhaps the most expensive drug bust in history. The British government's response is to declare war. They claim that China has violated the principles of free trade and has unjustly confiscated British property, conveniently ignoring the fact that the opium trade was illegal under Chinese law and that the substance being traded was causing enormous harm to Chinese society. British warships steam up the Chinese coast, bombarding forts and occupying ports, and the Qing forces, which have not fought a major war in generations and whose military technology is decades behind European standards, are quickly defeated. The war ends with the Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, which forces China to pay reparations, open additional ports to foreign trade, and cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain. Notably, the treaty does not explicitly legalize opium, but the practical effect is that British merchants can now sell it more or less openly. This is not the end of the story, however. The problem of opium addiction continues to worsen, and when Chinese authorities make further attempts to restrict the trade, Britain and France launch a second opium war in 1856. This conflict is even more one-sided than the first, and it ends with the sack of the Summer Palace in Beijing, one of the most beautiful architectural complexes in China, which is looted and burned by British and French troops. The subsequent treaty legalizes opium importation completely and extracts even more concessions from the weakened Qing government. The consequences of these opium wars for China are catastrophic and long-lasting. By the late 19th century, tens of millions of Chinese are addicted to opium, and the drug has penetrated all levels of society, from the poorest laborers to wealthy merchants to government officials. The social fabric frays as people prioritize obtaining their next fix over family responsibilities, work obligations, and communal ties. The economic drain is enormous, with vast quantities of silver flowing out of China to pay for imported opium, even as domestic opium cultivation increases to meet demand. The Qing dynasty, humiliated by military defeats and unable to cope with the scale of the addiction crisis, loses the mandate of heaven in the eyes of many Chinese, and the empire enters a terminal decline that will culminate in revolution and the establishment of the Republic in 1912. As you sit in your office, now an old man near the end of your career, you look back on decades of trying to stem the tide of opium and you feel a profound sense of failure. The problem has only grown worse, not better, and the tools available to address it, legal prohibitions, moral exhortation, public awareness campaigns, have proven woefully inadequate against the combined forces of addiction, poverty, and foreign economic pressure. You wonder what will become of your country, whether future generations will find solutions that eluded yours, or whether this poison that entered through the ports will continue to spread until there is nothing left of the great civilization you have served all your life. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, opium is also reshaping societies, though in different ways and with different justifications. In 19th century America, opium and its derivatives are readily available, sold in various forms and marketed with claims that range from modest to absurd. Patent medicines, those bottled concoctions with proprietary formulas and promises of miracle cures, often contain substantial quantities of opiates along with alcohol and various other active ingredients. A mother whose infant will not stop crying can purchase Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contains morphine and will indeed soothe the child into a stupor that the exhausted parent may mistake for peaceful sleep. A man suffering from chronic pain can buy any number of tonics and elixirs guaranteed to provide relief, and they do provide relief because they are essentially liquid opium dressed up with flavoring agents and bold marketing. The problem with patent medicines is that consumers have no idea what they are taking. The manufacturers are not required to list ingredients, and many deliberately keep their formulas secret to prevent competitors from copying them. People take these medicines believing they are harmless, and they only discover otherwise when they find themselves unable to stop taking them without experiencing terrible withdrawal symptoms. By the late 19th century, addiction to patent medicines is widespread, cutting across class and regional lines, affecting rural farmers and urban factory workers, respectable housewives and Civil War veterans whose battlefield injuries were treated with morphine and who never quite managed to stop using it. The American frontier, that mythical space that looms so large in the national imagination, has its own complicated relationship with opium. You are a cowboy, or perhaps a prospector, or maybe a settler trying to scratch out a living from unforgiving land. Life is hard in ways that are difficult for later, more comfortable generations to fully appreciate. There are no doctors for hundreds of miles, no hospitals, no emergency services of any kind. If you get sick or injured, you treat yourself with whatever is at hand, and you hope for the best. The general store in the nearest town stocks a limited selection of medicines, mostly patent remedies with impressive names and vague claims. Among these is inevitably some form of opium, perhaps labeled as Dr. McGillicuddy's celebrated calming cough pellets, or Hamlin's wizard oil, or any of 100 other creative names. You purchase a tin of lozenges that promise to soothe coughs and calm nervous afflictions. The taste is medicinal but not unpleasant, like horehound candy with a slightly bitter aftertaste. You find that they do indeed help with your cough, the result of too many nights sleeping rough in damp conditions, but they also help with your general mood, taking the edge off the loneliness and monotony of frontier life. You begin taking them more regularly, one with breakfast to face the day, another at lunch when the heat and the flies become oppressive, a third before bed to quiet the thoughts that otherwise keep you awake. You do not think of yourself as addicted, a word that in any case has not yet entered common usage in the sense we understand it today. You are simply using medicine as directed, or perhaps slightly more than directed, but surely there is no harm in that. The mining camps and boomtowns that spring up wherever gold or silver is discovered are rife with opium use. Miners, who work in dangerous conditions for long hours and often suffer injuries, use opiates to manage pain and exhaustion. Prostitutes, trapped in a brutal existence with few options for escape, use opium to numb themselves to their circumstances. Gamblers and drifters, men without roots or futures, smoke opium in dens that exist on the margins of these marginal societies. The line between use and abuse, between medicine and vice, is blurry and perhaps meaningless in places where simply surviving until tomorrow is an achievement. Chinese immigrants, who come to America in large numbers during the 19th century to work on railroads and in mines and laundries, bring with them their own opium practices, and they establish opium dens in the Chinatowns that form in many cities. These dens become objects of fascination and moral panic for white Americans, who view them as sites of depravity and corruption, conveniently ignoring the fact that white Americans are consuming vast quantities of opiates in their own preferred forms. The association of opium with Chinese immigrants contributes to racist policies and attitudes, and some of the first drug control laws in the United States are explicitly aimed at Chinese opium smoking while ignoring the opiate content of patent medicines marketed to white consumers. By the beginning of the 20th century, a reform movement has begun to gain momentum. Journalists, doctors, religious leaders, and social reformers are calling attention to the problem of opiate addiction and demanding government action. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, while primarily focused on the meatpacking industry, also touches on patent medicine fraud. Samuel Hopkins Adams publishes a series of articles titled The Great American Fraud, exposing the dangers of patent medicines and the false claims made by their manufacturers. The American Medical Association, which is working to establish medicine as a regulated profession with clear standards and ethics, supports efforts to control opiate distribution and use. In 1906, Congress passes the Pure Food and Drug Act, which requires medicines sold in interstate commerce to list their ingredients on the label. This is a revolutionary change, for it means that consumers can now see exactly what they are taking, and many are shocked to discover that their favorite tonic or soothing syrup contains substantial amounts of opium or morphine or cocaine, another plant-derived drug that has been widely used and is beginning to cause similar problems. Sales of many patent medicines drop precipitously once their contents are revealed, suggesting that consumers were not seeking intoxication but genuinely believed they were taking harmless herbal remedies. But labeling requirements alone do not solve the problem of addiction. Many people who have been taking opiate-containing medicines for years find that they cannot stop without experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms, and the medical profession is only beginning to understand addiction as a medical rather than moral issue. Some doctors try to help addicted patients by gradually reducing their doses, a tapering approach that is basically sound but requires patience and cooperation that not all patients can maintain. Others prescribe substitutes, sometimes switching patients from morphine to heroin, which, in a stunning display of misguided optimism, is initially marketed as a non-addictive alternative to morphine. This does not work out well, as heroin proves to be even more addictive than the drugs it was meant to replace. The story of heroin is worth examining in more detail, for it illustrates how scientific progress and commercial ambition can combine to create disasters despite the best intentions. In 1874, a chemist working at a hospital in London synthesizes diacetyl morphine, a derivative of morphine created by adding two acetyl groups to the morphine molecule. This new compound is more potent than morphine and appears to work more quickly, but the chemist does not pursue the discovery further. 24 years later, a German pharmaceutical company called Bayer, the same company that has recently developed aspirin, begins producing and marketing diacetyl morphine under the trade name heroin. They promote it as a treatment for coughs, colds, and morphine addiction, claiming that it is safer and non-addictive. This claim is based on limited testing and a fundamental misunderstanding of how opiates affect the brain and body. Heroin is a commercial success, at least initially. Doctors prescribe it enthusiastically, and patients report that it does indeed work very well for coughs and pain. What becomes apparent only gradually is that heroin is extraordinarily addictive, more so than morphine, and that users develop tolerance and dependence with frightening speed. By the time Bayer realizes the magnitude of the problem, heroin has spread widely and a new wave of addiction is underway. The company quietly stops marketing heroin in the early years of the 20th century, but the damage is done. The drug, now produced illegally by criminal organizations, will go on to cause misery and death on a scale that dwarfs its brief career as a legitimate medicine. The early 20th century sees the first serious international efforts to control opiate production and distribution. The Shanghai Opium Commission of 1909 brings together representatives from 13 nations to discuss the opium problem, focusing particularly on the situation in China, which remains dire decades after the Opium Wars. This is followed by the Hague Convention of 1912, which establishes international controls on opium and cocaine and represents the beginning of what will become the modern system of drug prohibition. The United States passes the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in 1914, which requires that anyone who produces, imports, or distributes opiates or cocaine must register with the federal government and pay taxes on their transactions. While the law is framed as a tax measure rather than an outright ban, in practice it is used to prosecute doctors who prescribe opiates to addicted patients and to shut down the remaining legal sources of these drugs for non-medical use. The shift from a system in which opiates were freely available to one in which they were tightly controlled and eventually largely banned happens over the course of about 3 decades, from the 1890s to the 1920s. This shift is driven by multiple factors. There is genuine concern about addiction and its social costs. There is moral panic fueled by racist attitudes toward Chinese immigrants and, later, toward African Americans and other minorities who are portrayed, usually falsely, as major users of these drugs. There is the professionalization of medicine, with doctors seeking to establish their authority and eliminate competition from patent medicine vendors and other irregular healers. And there is the growth of the federal government's power and its willingness to involve itself in areas of life that had previously been considered private matters. The consequences of prohibition are complex and not always what its advocates expected. Making opiates illegal does reduce use among some segments of the population, particularly the middle class and respectable working class who are unwilling to break the law or associate with criminal elements. But it does not eliminate demand, and where there is demand and a commodity is illegal, criminal organizations move in to meet that demand. A black market in opiates develops, with heroin emerging as the drug of choice because it is potent, portable, and profitable. The price rises dramatically compared to what the same drugs cost when they were legal, and users often turn to crime to support their habits. Addiction, rather than being treated as a medical problem, is increasingly treated as a criminal matter, with users arrested and incarcerated rather than offered treatment. Now we must return to the international stage and examine how opium shaped geopolitics in the 20th century, particularly in Asia. The story of the Golden Triangle, that region where the borders of Laos, Burma, and Thailand meet, illustrates how drug production can become intertwined with war, politics, and the Cold War struggle between superpowers. You are a CIA officer operating in Laos during the 1960s, a period when the United States is deeply involved in the Vietnam War and is conducting a secret war in neighboring Laos to prevent communist forces from using that country as a supply route. Your job is to work with local forces, primarily Hmong tribesmen who are strongly anti-communist and willing to fight against the Pathet Lao communist insurgency, but who lack resources and need American support. This support comes in many forms: weapons, training, money, and a willingness to overlook certain activities that would be problematic if they received too much scrutiny. The Hmong and other local groups in the Golden Triangle have been growing opium poppies for generations. It is a traditional crop, well suited to the mountainous terrain and poor soil, and it provides income that is impossible to achieve through other forms of agriculture. The morphine base derived from opium is relatively easy to transport, unlike bulkier crops, and it commands high prices from traffickers who smuggle it to processing facilities where it is converted into heroin. Some of this heroin ends up in American cities, where it fuels a growing epidemic of addiction, but this connection is not one that you or your superiors are eager to examine too closely. The rationale for tolerating or even facilitating opium production by America's anti-communist allies is based on pragmatism and moral compromise. These allies need money to fund their military operations, and opium is their most reliable source of income. If the United States were to insist that they abandon opium cultivation, they might lose their willingness to fight, or they might switch sides and align with the communists, who are not squeamish about the drug trade. And so a blind eye is turned. Planes belonging to Air America, an airline owned by the CIA, transport supplies to remote mountain villages, and while officially these planes carry only humanitarian aid and military equipment, there are persistent rumors and later investigations that conclude these same planes often carry opium on their return flights. The consequences of this policy extend far beyond Southeast Asia. The heroin produced from Golden Triangle opium finds its way to American troops fighting in Vietnam, where the stress of combat, the easy availability of the drug, and a culture of substance use contribute to widespread addiction. Studies conducted after the war estimate that as many as 15% of American servicemen in Vietnam used heroin. And while most of these men stop using after returning home, a significant minority continue, contributing to a domestic heroin epidemic that will plague American cities for decades. The irony is bitter. America fights a war ostensibly to defend freedom and democracy, and in the process it enables a drug trade that will cause tremendous suffering to its own citizens. The Golden Triangle remains a major opium-producing region through the end of the 20th century, though its dominance will eventually be challenged by Afghanistan, which emerges as the world's leading opium producer in the 1990s and continues to hold that position into the 21st century. But before we turn to that final chapter of our story, we must examine what was happening in the developed world during the late 20th century, particularly the pharmaceutical industry's development of new synthetic and semi-synthetic opioids and the terrible epidemic that would result. The story of the opioid crisis that begins in the 1990s and continues to devastate communities today is in many ways a story of déjà vu, of lessons not learned from history, of overconfidence in medical science, and of the dangers that arise when profit motives override concerns about patient welfare. You are living in the United States in the mid-1990s. Your life is reasonably comfortable, your problems are manageable, and you have no reason to think that a visit to the doctor for chronic back pain is about to set you on a path that will consume your life. The doctor, a well-meaning professional who has been trained to take pain seriously and to treat it aggressively, prescribes a medication called OxyContin. This is a time-release formulation of oxycodone, an opioid pain medication that has been around since 1916, but which has been reformulated by Purdue Pharma into a pill that is supposed to provide 12 hours of steady pain relief. The company has mounted an aggressive marketing campaign, sending sales representatives to doctors' offices across the country, hosting conferences at luxury resorts where physicians are wined and dined and educated about pain management, and distributing literature that emphasizes the safety of opioid medications when used as prescribed for legitimate medical purposes. The key claim that Purdue makes, and which its sales force repeats countless times to doctors, is that OxyContin has a low potential for addiction because the time-release formulation provides steady levels of the drug in the bloodstream rather than the peaks and valleys associated with immediate-release formulations. This claim is based on questionable evidence and represents a catastrophic misunderstanding or deliberate misrepresentation of addiction science. In reality, all opioids have significant addiction potential, and the time-release mechanism does nothing to reduce that risk. Moreover, users quickly discover that crushing the pills defeats the time-release mechanism and provides an intense high, making OxyContin attractive not only to pain patients but to those seeking euphoria. You take your prescription as directed, one pill every 12 hours, and you find that it does indeed help with your pain. For the first time in months, you can move without wincing, sleep without waking every time you shift position, and go about your daily activities without constantly being reminded of your injury. This relief is wonderful, genuinely life-changing, and you are grateful to your doctor for providing it. But over time, subtle changes occur. The pain relief that once lasted a full 12 hours seems to wear off sooner, after 10 hours or 8 hours or even less. You find yourself watching the clock, counting down the minutes until you can take your next dose. When you mention this to your doctor, he increases your dosage and the relief is restored, but only temporarily before the same pattern repeats. What you are experiencing is the development of tolerance, a normal physiological response to repeated opioid exposure, in which the body adapts to the presence of the drug and requires increasingly large doses to achieve the same effect. This process is well understood by pharmacologists, but somehow the information does not make it into the marketing materials that Purdue provides or the training that doctors receive. You are also developing physical dependence, which means that your body has adjusted to functioning with opioids in your system and will react badly if you suddenly stop taking them. If you miss a dose or try to cut back, you experience symptoms that include sweating, nausea, muscle aches, anxiety, and an overwhelming craving for the drug. These symptoms are not simply psychological weakness, as some people assume, but the result of real neurological changes caused by prolonged opioid exposure. Your doctor, faced with your escalating needs and perhaps not fully understanding the situation, continues to increase your dosage, and at some point you cross an invisible line from medical use to dependence to addiction. You begin taking pills more frequently than prescribed. You seek out additional doctors who will prescribe more medication, a practice known as doctor shopping. You run out of your prescription early and experience days of misery waiting for the refill. Your life begins to narrow, revolving increasingly around obtaining and taking the pills, and the things that once mattered to you, your relationships, your work, your hobbies, become secondary to the need for opioids. You are not alone. Across the United States, millions of people are following similar trajectories, prescribed opioids for legitimate pain, and finding themselves trapped in cycles of dependence and addiction. The consequences ripple through families and communities. Children grow up with addicted parents unable to provide consistent care. Workers lose jobs due to absenteeism or poor performance. Emergency rooms are overwhelmed with overdose cases. And deaths climb steadily, from a few thousand per year in the late 1990s to tens of thousands by the early 2000s. The turning point comes when the prescription supply is cut off, either because a doctor refuses to continue prescribing, or because new regulations limit how much can be prescribed, or because the patient's insurance company balks at covering such expensive medication. Faced with the unbearable symptoms of withdrawal and lacking access to medical treatment for addiction, many users turn to heroin, which provides similar effects at a fraction of the cost. The heroin available on the street is far more dangerous than pharmaceutical opioids. The dosage is unpredictable, it may be contaminated with other substances, and increasingly it is mixed with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, and which can cause overdose death with a dose measured in milligrams. The opioid crisis becomes a national emergency, claiming more American lives annually than car accidents or gun violence. The response is slow and inadequate, hampered by stigma, limited funding for treatment, and the sheer scale of the problem. Eventually, lawsuits are filed against Purdue Pharma and other pharmaceutical companies, and against the distributors who shipped billions of pills to small towns that could not possibly have legitimate need for such quantities. Evidence emerges that company executives knew about the addiction risks and the widespread abuse of their products, but chose to prioritize profits over public health. In 2019, Purdue Pharma files for bankruptcy as part of a settlement that will pay billions to states and municipalities, though no amount of money can undo the damage or bring back those who have died. As we reach the end of this long journey through opium's history, we arrive at a present moment that in many ways resembles the past. Afghanistan, that nation which has suffered through decades of war, Soviet invasion, civil war, Taliban rule, American occupation, and Taliban rule again, is currently the source of approximately 85% of the world's illicit opium. Despite international efforts to eradicate poppy cultivation, despite alternative development programs meant to encourage farmers to grow other crops, despite the prohibitions enforced by various governments, the poppies continue to grow because they provide income to some of the poorest people on Earth. People who have few options and many reasons to take whatever opportunity presents itself. The heroin produced from Afghan opium, and increasingly the synthetic opioids produced in laboratories that require no poppies at all, continue to flow across borders and into communities worldwide. The patterns of use and addiction vary by region and population, but the fundamental story remains the same. People in pain, whether physical or psychological or spiritual, seek relief. They find it temporarily in substances that alter consciousness and numb suffering. And then they find that the relief comes with a price, a debt that must be paid in health, in freedom, in life itself. But this is not only a story of tragedy and failure, it is also a story of resilience and hope. Addiction is treatable. People recover, rebuild their lives, reconnect with loved ones, and find meaning beyond the narrow pursuit of the next dose. The understanding of addiction has evolved dramatically, from viewing it as moral failure to recognizing it as a chronic brain disease that requires medical treatment. Medications like methadone and buprenorphine allow people to manage opioid dependence without the chaos of street drug use. Naloxone, a drug that can reverse opioid overdoses and save lives, is increasingly available to first responders and community members. Harm reduction approaches that meet users where they are, rather than demanding abstinence before providing help, are being adopted, slowly and against significant opposition, but adopted nonetheless. The poppy itself remains, beautiful and dangerous, growing in fields across Afghanistan and Burma and Tasmania, where it is cultivated legally for pharmaceutical production. Its red petals open to the sun, indifferent to human struggles, neither good nor evil, but simply existing as it has existed for millions of years, long before humans discovered its properties and began the long, complicated dance of use and abuse that we have traced tonight. As you lie in the darkness, your own consciousness drifting toward sleep, perhaps you can feel the weight of all this history, the accumulated choices and chances, the suffering and the relief, the empires risen and fallen, the policies enacted and abandoned, the millions of individual lives touched by this single plant. It is a story without a clear ending, without a simple moral, but it is our story, part of what it means to be human, with all the wisdom and foolishness that entails. The ancient Sumerians, who first called it the joy plant, could not have imagined where their discovery would lead, how it would shape the rise and fall of nations, how it would ease the pain of billions while creating new agonies. The Chinese officials who fought to keep opium out of their country could not stop the tide of commerce and addiction. The Victorian mothers who gave soothing syrup to their crying infants did not understand what they were doing. The soldiers returning from Vietnam, the patients prescribed OxyContin, the farmers in Afghanistan growing poppies to feed their families, all are caught in patterns larger than themselves, repeating cycles that history has seen before and will surely see again, unless we learn, finally, to approach these substances with the wisdom and caution they demand. So sleep now, if you can. Let the story settle into your bones and your memory. Tomorrow, the world will still be wrestling with these questions, still seeking the balance between relieving suffering and preventing harm, still trying to honor human dignity while acknowledging human frailty. The poppy will still be blooming somewhere, red as blood, delicate as hope, ancient as desire itself. And we will continue, as we always have, to make our choices and live with their consequences, for better and for worse, until the story finally, eventually, somehow finds its ending.